The spring of 1945 brought devastation to Okinawa, turning peaceful villages into battlefields and once familiar hills into smoking wastelands. The air was filled with the roar of artillery, the crackle of burning homes, and the distant shouts of soldiers on both sides. In this storm of violence, the fabric of everyday life unraveled with terrifying speed. Families scattered as shells exploded overhead, each person desperately trying to cling to loved ones and find shelter. But in the panic, not every child could be held tightly enough, and not every parent could fight their way back through the chaos. Amidst the confusion, along a dusty path hidden between scorched rice fields and broken fences, a small group of Japanese toddlers appeared. Their faces were streaked with dirt and tears, their clothing little more than tattered scraps. Most were barefoot, their feet calloused and bleeding, but they moved on, driven by a primal need for safety. The oldest among them, a girl with tangled hair and a faded ribbon, looked no more than 5. The youngest, just a toddler, clung to a battered cloth doll, her eyes wide with confusion. The war, incomprehensible to adults, was beyond the grasp of these children. The sounds that had once signaled daily routines, bells, voices, the chirping of birds, had been replaced by thunderous gunfire and the harsh shouts of men. The children did not cry out. Even the youngest had learned that noise might bring danger. Instead, they moved in wary silence, glancing over their shoulders, searching for faces they knew, and shrinking back from every shadow. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, and thirst cracked their lips. Days had passed since any of them had tasted real food or clean water. Some had managed to scavenge a handful of dried beans or a wilted leaf, but their energy was nearly gone. Every step seemed harder than the last, and the path ahead was blurred by exhaustion. Some stumbled and fell, only to be helped up by the others, children helping children because there was no one else left. Memories of home faded quickly in a world reduced to survival. Some children clung to fragments of memory, a mother's lullaby, the warmth of the futon, the smell of rice cooking, but these comforts seemed impossibly distant now. The sky, once a sheltering blue, was choked with smoke and filled with the dread of falling bombs. At night, the children huddled together beneath the skeletal remains of a tree, shivering in the cold and listening to the angry thunder of distant battles. As they wandered, the group grew smaller. A few had collapsed by the roadside, too weak to go on, while others disappeared into the confusion of the fleeing crowds. Those who remained pressed forward with dogged determination, their small bodies resilient in the face of terror and loss. Their eyes, once bright with curiosity, now reflected only fear and confusion. Time lost all meaning in this world of violence. The sun rose and set behind veils of smoke, casting strange shadows across the ruined land. The children did not count the days or measure the distance. They knew only the urge to keep moving, to find a place where the war could not reach them. But everywhere they turned, there was only more destruction, more reminders of a life that no longer existed. The sense of abandonment was profound. For the first time, these children were utterly alone, surrounded by strangers who had their own families to protect. Adults, when glimpsed, moved quickly past with lowered heads, unwilling or unable to help. The children's world had shrunk to the few familiar faces beside them and the uncertain ground beneath their feet. In the end, what kept them together was not hope, but the shared instinct for survival. They moved as a silent pack, each child watching out for the next. In the devastation of Okinawa, they became both lost and found, orphans of war, but bound to each other by the simple act of walking forward, step by step, into the unknown. The day began like any other in the shattered landscape of Okinawa, gray, smoky, and tense. American soldiers from Sergeant Daniel Harper's unit moved cautiously along a road littered with debris, always alert for snipers or ambushes. Their faces were hardened by weeks of relentless combat, their eyes trained to spot the slightest hint of movement among the ruins. Every ruined house, every abandoned vehicle was a potential threat. The soldiers kept their rifles ready, moving in a formation that had become instinct after so many days of survival. As the patrol reached a crossroads, a strange, unsettling sight came into view. A line of small figures appeared ahead, barely visible through drifting smoke and swaying reeds. At first, the soldiers thought it might be a ruse, perhaps Japanese soldiers using children as a shield, or a ploy to lure them into an ambush. The men stopped in their tracks, hearts pounding, hands tight on their weapons. The rules of war demanded suspicion. Even innocence could be a mask for danger. But as the figures drew closer, their true nature became heartbreakingly clear. These were children, no older than 5, some hardly more than infants, their faces smeared with dirt and their eyes wide with terror. The smallest was limping, clutching the hand of an older girl. Their clothes hung in tatters, and none of them wore shoes. For a long moment, the battlefield seemed to hold its breath, as if stunned by the simple tragedy of their presence. One of the soldiers, Private Thomas Clark, felt his own childhood memories stir. He hesitated, then raised his hand to halt the patrol. A tense silence followed as the men debated what to do. Some whispered that it could still be a trap. Others argued for caution, not compassion. In the end, the sight of such helplessness was too powerful to ignore. Sergeant Harper motioned for everyone to lower their weapons and approached slowly, trying not to startle the children. The children froze, uncertain whether to run or remain still. One girl squeezed her brother's hand so tightly that her knuckles turned white. A few steps behind, another child began to cry, but her voice was little more than a whimper lost in the wind. The soldiers tried to make themselves less threatening, kneeling or holding out empty hands to show they meant no harm. Their hearts ached at the sight, but they knew any sudden move could send the children fleeing back into danger. To break the impasse, one soldier pulled a piece of bread from his pack and set it carefully on the ground. The children watched with suspicion and hunger, unsure if this was a gift or a trick. After a long, tense pause, one boy inched forward and snatched the bread before scurrying back to the safety of the group. It was a tiny gesture, but it signaled the beginning of a fragile trust. Slowly, the soldiers began to gather whatever food and water they could spare. Canteens were passed forward, small morsels offered, and one medic produced a rag doll to comfort the youngest girl. The children remained wary, their eyes searching the soldiers' faces for any sign of threat. But little by little, their fear began to soften, as they realized no one intended to hurt them. The moment was surreal for the Americans. They had expected hostility or indifference from the local population, not a silent parade of lost toddlers. Some soldiers found their own resolve faltering, the horrors of war briefly eclipsed by the raw, undeniable humanity in front of them. It was a reminder that the enemy was not always a faceless force. Sometimes it was a child needing help in a world turned upside down. Even as the tension eased, the danger was far from over. The area was still an active war zone, with snipers, stray shells, and hidden mines. The soldiers quickly realized that to leave the children here would be a death sentence. Plans were made to carry them back to the safety of the American camp. For the first time in weeks, the men felt a different kind of urgency, the need to protect, not destroy. In this way, the battlefield became, for a brief moment, a place of mercy. Battle-hardened GIs, more used to carrying rifles than children, now found themselves cradling frightened toddlers and whispering soft reassurances. As they turned back toward their lines, each soldier carried more than a child. He carried the fragile hope that even in war, compassion could still survive. In the first tense minutes after contact, the children remained rooted in place, unsure of what to make of the soldiers surrounding them. Their eyes darted nervously between the Americans, searching for any sign of kindness or threat. Every instinct told them to run, but exhaustion and fear anchored their feet to the ground. Some clung to each other, forming a fragile human chain, their small hands clutching with desperate strength. Even the simplest gesture from the soldiers, an outstretched hand, a gentle word, was met with suspicion and caution. The Americans, aware of how easily the situation could turn, moved slowly and spoke softly, relying on tone and body language to convey safety. Private Clark knelt and removed his helmet, trying to look less intimidating. He smiled and offered a canteen, but the children only stared, unblinking. They did not reach for the water. It was as if a wall of invisible glass stood between the two groups, built from weeks of trauma and years of propaganda. With each passing minute, the silence weighed heavier. The soldiers exchanged worried glances, unsure how to bridge the chasm of fear. Someone remembered that food was a universal language, so another piece of bread was offered. Then a small tin of condensed milk. The children edged forward, drawn by hunger, but hesitated at the last moment. Finally, the girl with the ribbon stepped up, grabbed the bread, and retreated just as quickly, sharing it with the youngest beside her. The first acceptance of food broke the impasse. One by one, the children gathered closer, watching the soldiers carefully, but daring to hope. The medic checked their wounds, tending to scrapes and insect bites, moving gently so as not to frighten them further. The youngest child, at last, accepted a sip of water, and a thin smile flickered across her lips. For the first time, the soldiers saw the possibility of trust in the children's eyes. Despite these tentative gestures, mistrust lingered. When a soldier tried to lift one of the toddlers, the child recoiled and whimpered, eyes wide with panic. The Americans quickly learned to move slowly, always keeping their hands visible, never separating the children from each other. It became clear that whatever kindness they offered would be accepted only on the children's terms and only after repeated reassurance. Transporting the group back to camp presented its own challenges. The children refused to ride in vehicles unless they were together, crowded into the back seat, arms and legs entwined. Some soldiers improvised by carrying two at a time, balancing them on their hips as they navigated rubble-strewn roads. The children remained silent, clinging to their rescuers, but never fully relaxing, always watchful and wary. On the way, the group encountered other refugees and passing patrols. Adults stared in disbelief at the sight of GIs cradling Japanese children, unsure whether to be grateful or afraid. Some murmured prayers of thanks. Others averted their eyes, unwilling to trust that mercy could come from the enemy. The children sensed this uncertainty and clung even tighter to the only safety they had found. At the American Field Hospital, nurses and medics took over, using broken Japanese and gentle smiles to coax the children inside. Baths were drawn, clean clothes found, and bandages applied. The little ones huddled together on a cot, refusing to be separated even for a moment. No one slept soundly the first night. The children's sleep was restless, punctuated by whimpers and cries. In the days that followed, the soldiers visited the children, bringing small gifts and attempting to make them laugh. The boundaries of mistrust, though formidable, began to erode, replaced slowly by the routines of care and kindness. Each act of patience, each gentle touch, served as a silent promise that the world could still hold a place for innocence, even in the midst of war. Trust would not come easily or quickly, but in the slow thaw between soldier and child, something rare and precious began to take root, a fragile understanding that kindness could reach across even the deepest scars left by violence and fear. The journey from the battlefield to safety was a trial in itself. The roads were littered with shattered vehicles, splintered trees, and the haunting remains of burned villages. Every step forward was shadowed by the threat of hidden mines and the eerie silence that sometimes followed distant artillery. The soldiers moved with vigilance, scanning the fields for any sign of danger, while carrying the children in their arms or bundled in jackets. The smallest clung tightly to their rescuers' necks, their tiny fingers digging into fabric, as if afraid to be lost again. Some of the children, too weak to walk, had to be carried the entire way. The Americans took turns, swapping burdens so that no one grew too tired or overwhelmed. With every mile, the weight of responsibility pressed heavier on the men. These battle-hardened soldiers, accustomed to bloodshed and loss, now measured their success not by enemy casualties, but by every frightened face that reached safety. The change in their own hearts surprised many of them. The children rarely spoke. Instead, they watched the world with wide, haunted eyes, flinching at sudden sounds and shrinking back from loud voices. Even simple acts, like drinking from a canteen or accepting a piece of chocolate, were done in wary silence. One little boy, barely 3, wouldn't let go of the sleeve of the soldier who carried him, as if that single connection was all that kept him anchored to hope. Arrival at the field hospital was both relief and challenge. Nurses, many of whom had never seen Japanese children up close, set aside their own nerves to focus on care. They drew warm baths and scrubbed the grime from small bodies, sometimes working in pairs as the children cried and clung to each other. Medical staff gently examined bruises, set splints for twisted ankles, and covered wounds with clean bandages. Some of the children shrank from touch, expecting pain, but a soft word or patient smile could slowly calm their panic. Language was a barrier, but kindness bridged the gap. One nurse, Helen Davis, had learned a handful of Japanese phrases and used them, awkward but sincere, to soothe and distract. She gave the children simple toys, wooden blocks, a fabric ball, a battered doll left by another refugee, and encouraged them to play, even for a few minutes. Sometimes a tiny giggle would break through the gloom, and the adults would exchange glances, silently grateful for these small miracles. Outside the medical tents, soldiers continued their watch, checking in on the children during breaks from duty. Some read from picture books or traced shapes in the dirt to elicit a smile. A few of the men who had never thought themselves capable of gentleness now found themselves singing softly, inventing games, or braiding hair. The camp, once defined by tension and suspicion, began to change with the presence of laughter and the return of childish curiosity. Not all the children had families to reclaim them. As word spread, some mothers arrived, wild-eyed and desperate, weeping as they swept their children into trembling embraces. For those left unclaimed, the Americans took extra care, making sure no child felt alone. Foster arrangements were made with local villagers, or in some cases with the Red Cross. The soldiers who had rescued the children checked in daily, unwilling to sever the fragile bonds that had formed. As days passed, the children's wounds, physical and emotional, began to heal. Their sleep grew less troubled, their movements less cautious. They began to explore the camp, drawn to the ordinary routines of meal preparation, laundry, and song. In the evenings, children and soldiers sat together under makeshift lanterns, sharing what little they had. trust, once unimaginable, grew quietly between them. For the American soldiers, these days became a kind of redemption. War had stripped away much of their certainty and comfort, but in carrying these children to safety, they rediscovered compassion. Each gentle touch, each effort to ease a nightmare, served as proof that even amid destruction, humanity could survive. The memory of those children's hands in theirs would outlast the sounds of battle. The makeshift camp soon transformed from a place of emergency to a small, living community. American soldiers, once so focused on tactics and survival, now became caretakers, learning to tend to the children's daily needs. They helped the younger ones bathe, shared their rations, and taught them simple games with pebbles and sticks. For many soldiers, this was the first time in months they'd heard laughter ring out in the open air. The presence of children brought an unexpected sense of hope to a landscape scarred by violence. Children quickly adapted to their new world. Within a few days, the shyness and wariness that had dominated their eyes began to fade. Some formed little groups, inventing their own games and play-fighting in the dust. Others watched the soldiers with growing curiosity, mimicking their salutes or marching behind them in tiny, disorganized lines. The smallest clung to their American protectors, learning to trust hands that once carried weapons. Medical care continued around the clock. Army medics and nurses treated lingering infections and malnutrition and spent long hours comforting children through nightmares and feverish nights. Helen Davis, the nurse who spoke a little Japanese, organized afternoon classes under a tarp, teaching both language and simple songs. Even the most withdrawn children gradually emerged from their shells, daring to join in the singing or clutching at a crayon as they scribbled on scraps of paper. Daily life took on a new rhythm. Soldiers and children shared chores, carrying water, folding blankets, washing clothes in big metal tubs. Meals were humble, mostly rice, beans, and bits of canned meat, but they were shared with a quiet ceremony. On special days, someone would produce a bar of chocolate or a tin of condensed milk, and the children's eyes would light up in awe. These little rituals created a sense of family where there had once been only loss. Some of the older children became helpers, looking after the youngest and assisting with small tasks around camp. They took pride in their new responsibilities, understanding instinctively that survival depended on everyone playing a part. The Americans encouraged this, offering praise and gentle guidance. The children's dignity and sense of purpose began to blossom in ways that even war could not suppress. For the soldiers, the presence of children brought healing as well. Letters home changed in tone. No longer just lists of dangers and deprivations, but stories of the children's antics and progress. Many soldiers confessed that helping the children was the only thing that had made the horrors of war bearable. Evenings around the campfire became times of quiet reflection, with laughter and stories softening memories of combat. Occasionally, children were reunited with relatives who appeared in camp, searching for the lost. These meetings were bittersweet, marked by tears, embraces, and sometimes the heartbreaking absence of those who would never return. Still, for every child who found a parent, hope was restored in small, powerful ways. The Americans supported these reunions with as much discretion and respect as possible, knowing the wounds of separation could never fully heal. The little camp began to attract attention from surrounding villages and American officers alike. Visitors came, sometimes bringing supplies, or simply watching from a respectful distance. The story of the rescued children spread quickly, inspiring kindness and donations. The example of American soldiers caring for Japanese orphans challenged old prejudices and reminded everyone that even enemies could show mercy. As spring deepened, the camp filled with green shoots and birdsong. The children's laughter grew stronger, echoing through the trees, and the sense of fear faded a little each day. Soldiers and children built small gardens together, planting seeds that promised a future beyond war. For all who lived there, the first spring after battle became a symbol, a promise that even on scorched earth, new life and hope could take root. As the weeks passed, the story of the rescued children began to spread far beyond the boundaries of the camp. News traveled along battered roads and through whispered conversations among villagers, eventually reaching officers in distant command posts. American commanders recognized the importance of what had happened, understanding that such acts of compassion could help heal wounds deeper than any victory on the battlefield. The rescue became a symbol, recounted in letters home and by journalists who visited the camp, capturing images of soldiers holding children and sharing meals beneath makeshift tents. Some of the children were eventually reunited with surviving relatives, but for others, the Americans and the villagers became their new family. Local women visited the camp, bringing small gifts of food or clothing, and sometimes lingering to comfort the orphans. Red Cross workers and Japanese volunteers stepped in to help with daily care, weaving together a fragile but resilient network of support. No one forgot the loss these children had suffered, but together they created an environment where trust and love could grow. The soldiers who had carried the children from the battlefield were forever changed. They wrote home about the transformation they witnessed, not just in the children, but in themselves. Hardened by months of violence, they found that the act of protecting the vulnerable allowed them to reclaim a sense of humanity that war had tried to take. For many, those quiet moments spent holding a frightened child or watching a group of kids play in the sunshine became the memories they cherished most. Spring matured into early summer, and the camp blossomed with small gardens and handmade toys. The children learned new words, sang songs in both languages, and discovered laughter in places where only fear had lived before. Evenings brought a gentle peace, as children and soldiers gathered around campfires to share simple meals and stories. The boundary between rescuer and rescued blurred. They became a single, caring community, shaped by a unique chapter of survival and empathy. Occasionally, memories of loss would resurface, during the night, in the form of nightmares, or when a familiar face failed to return. The soldiers and nurses met these moments with patience, offering comfort and listening without judgment. They understood that healing from such deep trauma would take time, and that sometimes all they could offer was their presence. Yet each day brought new strength, and the children began to believe in the promise of tomorrow. Over time, the rescued children became living reminders of what could be salvaged from war's devastation. Their resilience inspired not only those in the camp, but also others throughout the region. The story of the Toddlers gently carried to safety by battle-hardened GIs was retold in villages, schools, and military bases, helping to shift perspectives and encourage reconciliation. It proved that even in the darkest times, acts of kindness could illuminate the way forward. Years later, those who had survived returned to the places where the camp once stood. Some brought their own children, eager to show them the tree under which they first tasted chocolate, or to point up the stones where they played with American soldiers. The memory of that spring, of hope rediscovered among the ruins, remained etched in their hearts. For the soldiers, the children's faces lingered long after the uniforms were packed away. They spoke of Okinawa not only as a battlefield, but as the place where they rediscovered compassion, friendship, and the healing power of small mercies. The legacy of those days lived on in letters, photographs, and the bonds forged across cultures and languages. In the end, the rescue was not remembered as a grand military triumph, but as a quiet victory of the spirit. It became proof that even in a world ravaged by hatred and violence, light could break through the ruins, and that a single act of care could change countless lives forever.